Another very interesting kind of concept that gets thrown in here is the caliber of people working at Ripple during all of this. I mean, I've looked over the Ripple team a couple times now, and it seems like every single time I dig into it, I find another person who came from the Treasury, another person who came from the Federal Reserve. Why do you think we have a company? I mean, right now, Ripple's literally still the size where it's considered a large startup kind of at this point. Why are there so many government agency people, so many people from the Treasury, so many people from the Federal Reserve, all finding themselves at this one small company having to do with payments?
Well, whether it's Ripple's strategy, whether it's their business strategy, or whether it's something that was pre-positioned by the government, either way, Ripple is emerging with XRP as the primary competitor to the dollar on a global stage. And I don't even think that's, people who say that's not valid or who would argue against that are people who don't necessarily understand the playing field, because Bitcoin and Ethereum are simply out of that race. They cannot be the global reserve currency as the dollar is. And most people don't understand that, the majority of other countries around the world back their own currencies with US Treasury bills. So via the Bretton Woods Agreement since 1946, the dollar is the global reserve currency. And in 1971, April 15th, if you want to be specific, Nixon dropped us off the gold standard and we became the first fiat currency with the US dollar and Federal Reserve note. And since then, we're in kind of the palliative care phase of the dollar in which it's dying. And there's really no denying that. 2008, 2009, really two crashes when you had the both the housing and the derivatives markets. You had a crash that really indicated the death of the dollar was here and it was coming. And the only way that the US was able to stave that off was printing more money. And I don't think that they were naive to what that meant. So they had to, at some point, start planning ahead for the future of how do we replace the dollar. And maybe at that time, Bitcoin might have been, very opportune in its timing to come out in 2009. And they may have found out along the way that this won't work. We need to adjust fire.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And building off of that, they started hyperinflating the US dollar. I mean, this started happening. We see a lot of headlines for this now, but this has been happening for the past 10, 15 years to an extensive degree. Like it's really been ramping up recently. And it kind of goes to the point where like it would make you've heard the saying, never let a good crisis go to waste. It's almost like,
Exactly.
why would you, right before the US dollar was going to lose its stronghold on the world stage, why would you not hyperinflate it away? If it's going to die either way and you could bail out a lot of debts, and you might as well inflate it if it's going to lose its reserve status anyway, because we're in a time period where realistically the US has all these crazy debts. There's all this crazy stuff going on in the world right now, and their solution for the past 15 years has been just to hyperinflate their currency and use that to pay off all their mistakes. And if it was already predetermined, kind of like you're alluding, that we were gonna have to make this change to a neutral currency that puts all countries on a level playing field, it's almost like you might as well keep up the pace, keep inflating the dollar, and finish it off kind of with a bang and get your kind of like last chance to use this mechanism that probably won't be able to be used again in the future.
Mhm. It's almost like you needed certain crises to take place.
Yeah, no. I mean, it's so funny because I put out a tweet kind of along these lines. I don't get too involved. There's a lot of conspiratorial ideas in the XRP community, but it's so funny because a lot of these people have been talking about like a lot of the events kind of we're watching play out right now since like 2018, 2019, like cyber
Mhm.
attacks, all this crazy stuff going on, and you just like look at it now and you're just like, wow. I mean, it's kind of funny to look back and see how much of this is actually playing out.
Yeah, I mean, and regardless of how much is a genuine like conspiracy that was planned by bad actors or not, most of this was predictable 20 to 50 years ago, depending on what you're talking about. The collapse of the US dollar has been predicted since the end of the gold standard. And really, it was shocking that it did survive coming off of the gold standard. And then we have, the civil unrest in the US since really 2015. And that was very predictable after 9/11, that within 15 to 25 years, you would have significant civil unrest and issues in the United States. The current geopolitical situation was very predictable based off of the fall of the Soviet Union.
Yeah, no, and I agree with a lot with the fact that I'm shocked too the US's ability to kind of push this outdated, decrepit system that's clearly falling apart for so long. And it kind of goes to the point where, like, for a while, it was like, what were you really going to switch to? There was no alternative. For the first time in history, we have assets like XRP and Bitcoin. And to your point, Bitcoin, because of its technological flaws, won't be able to fill the same role as something like XRP. But for the first time ever, you have these assets that could fulfill roles that we could never have in the past. And they're going to be ushered in because they solve a lot of the issues that are currently wrong with our monetary system. Like, our monetary system is a mess. Like, the more research you do on the way the US dollar is backed, the way our monetary system works, like, you lose confidence in everything going on very quickly. It's not a pretty sight.
Yeah, and I'll just plug Robert Kiyosaki, the author of Rich Dad Poor Dad, and I'm a big fan of his. But if you read and understand Rich Dad Poor Dad, you really understand that the only way that the U.S. dollar has persisted for the last 50 years the way that it has is because of the lack of financial literacy in the world. The majority of people simply don't understand how our monetary system works, and that's the only reason it works.
Yeah, I would say right now the US dollar is probably like 70% backed by the US military, and then the rest is just because the US is the biggest country in the world. But in terms of redemption or fundamental value, I mean, it's gone. Like, the
Yeah,
US has used the dollar as essentially a mechanism of war for the past 20 to 30 years. And you can't get away with that because no other country besides the US and a couple of the US's allies want that. You're forcing
exactly.
them into a system that the US can switch and use against them at any given moment.
And that's the situation we're in right now with the sanctions and using sanctions against Russia. And I'll be honest, I'm not a fan of sanctions. I would rather take a kinetic approach because sanctions themselves are going to push our own economy over the edge just as much as it pushes Russia, because we're not just pushing Russia, we're pushing Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, and whether we like it or not, that population alone is probably 15 times the United States. And there's what's called the BRICS alliance, which is Brazil, Russia, India, China, North Korea, and South Africa, which has basically committed to getting off the dollar and off the Federal Reserve note as the exchange currency. So every time we use these sanctions, we're really just pushing ourselves a little closer to that edge.
So I would take it based on that answer that you do not think Russia is too worried about getting kicked off SWIFT right now.
No, I don't think that SWIFT is much of a concern, and I think Russia pre-positioned for this invasion financially. They knew there would be sanctions, and of course that was expected. I don't think it's hurting Vladimir Putin's feelings that he's personally been sanctioned. I don't think he was trying to vacation in Las Vegas either. So most people don't necessarily understand what the sanctions are and what they do and what they don't do. For the most part, they don't do a lot to hurt someone who isn't trying to be involved in finances outside of Russia. I can only say this in a delicate way because of my own military background. But essentially, the initial sanctions towards Russia were towards the territories that were recognized as independent. And when those sanctions are on the territories that are being recognized by Russia, that just cuts those territories off from the financial world, except for Russia. So in a way, it was almost like that sanctions ceded those territories to Russia, with the exception of the pipeline, which, that pipeline, Nord 2, was something that we had been trying to shut down their pipeline connection to Germany, because Germany was ready to take 75% of their gas from Russia, which would have made NATO and Germany highly dependent on Russia. But we would have been producing more than the production of Nord 2 with the Keystone XL pipeline in the United States, which was shut down shortly after this administration came in.
Mm-hmm.
So if we all agree that shutting down a pipeline is what you do to hurt a enemy, then why did we shut down our own pipeline?
Oh, yeah, that stuff is just mind-boggling. You look at some of these decisions now and how avoidable they could have been. It's like, we talk a lot about how some of this stuff has to be pre-planned, and it's just like, well, how didn't you see that coming? Like, Germany's still getting 75% of its natural gas and oil from Russia. It's like, how was this not thought about? But
Yeah, and I mean, as far as this current conflict, we saw, since 2013, 2014, when there was the Russian separatist movement and annexation of Crimea, we saw that this was coming. We knew that Putin was massing these forces at the border. And the annexation of those two areas shouldn't be a surprise to anybody. But really, we weren't necessarily expecting Putin to go into a full invasion of Ukraine. So that's a little bit over what he needed to do. So he perhaps tipped his cards a little bit more than he should have.
yeah.